I'm David Good, University of Cambridge Psychology Department. I've been involved in the application of psychological ideas in practical context for a long time, particularly in areas of education and particularly with respect to a relationship between extreme values and violence.
Yes, I'm Andy, so I'm very glad to be here. I've only just got into the meeting, so I missed the beginning. My background is in teaching and publishing, so I'm looking at this as somebody working in textbooks and how textbook policy guides what happens in classrooms, particularly in low and middle income countries, which is where I work. So I've been working for 20 years as a short-term consultant in low and middle income countries in many parts of the world.
Hi, I'm Tiff. I'm the Programme Director at the Economist Foundation. We're a youth charity set up from within the Economist newspaper, and we focus on discussions about the news in classrooms and particular news literacy skills, so things like open-mindedness and speaking up, which very much frame themselves in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Will. Hi everyone, I'm Elnaz. I'm Head of Research and Impact at an organization called Skills Builder Partnership. So we advocate for essential skills to be embedded in education, everyday education. And I guess why I'm here is that there's a lot of overlap between the session skills that we promote within the Skills Builder Partnership and social and emotional learning. So I'm here to hear from all the expertise, but also contribute as much as I can. Thanks.
Hi everybody, Toby Salt. Our long history, and nice to see you again, Sharath. Hi, Toby. More than once. Yeah. So Department for Education Innovation Unit, then Deputy Chief Executive National College of School Leadership, then CEO of Ormiston Academies Trust, 37 academies in some of the most disadvantaged in England, and then CEO of AQA, the exam board, now Senior Advisor to AQA, but attending really in a personal capacity, bringing a school's perspective and an assessment capacity.
Hi everybody, I'm Catherine. I'm from Schole, and like Toby, I represent the school's perspective. We run local curriculum schools in Kenya and Uganda, currently educating about 4,500 students. And what Sharath said very much resonates with our experience, is that there's a very, very strong focus in these areas on academic outcomes. And one of the distinctive things that we feel we bring is this a child-centered ethos and attention to the whole child. We have some connection with STIR as well, who we know in the field, as our previous regional director is now regional director of STIR in Uganda.
Hi, I'm Alex Beard, and I work at Teach for All. We're a global network of organisations in 53 countries working to grow leadership, to improve education. And we've done a lot of work over the past couple of years around expanding our understanding of what success means for students around a set of broadened student outcomes and an idea of student leadership.
Hi everyone, I'm Edwin Page from Xavier Projects. I'm based in Kenya. We also work in Uganda with refugees. Generally, community-led education is our primary focus. We've been involved in education in refugee hosting areas for about 10 years or so. SEL clearly has a few unique dynamics. And some unique challenges, say, which I won't go into now, but so fascinated to hear more.
I'm Jane Mann, and I work with the Cambridge Partnership for Education, which is an engagement between Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment. We are essentially the team that works with ministries on education reform from those two parts of Cambridge, and we collaborate outwardly with Cambridge, hence the collaboration with David. We collaborated with David's team recently on the Learning Passport partnership with UNICEF, particularly looking at the social and emotional learning aspect of that learning. Well, it's an approach for refugee and displaced children to try and keep their learning alive when they are out of formal education. We've been particularly interested in the move from ministry partners towards acknowledging the need for SEL in programs and not just to focus on STEM.
So my name is Joycey John. I'm the Director for Education at Nesta. And Sharath and I go back many years, the very early phase of launching STIR, and Ross Hall is on the other breakout room probably, where we work together on a similar or precursor to STIR. So great to see you bringing all of us together. So at Nestor, we look at research, investments, funding, as well as convening. And we've done quite a lot of work on what are the skills that will be needed in the future, and how can we build some of these things like social and emotional skills, creativity, critical thinking. So really looking forward to learning from everyone here.
Thanks, Joycey. So in just a second, I'm going to fire the first question at you, which is, what is the role of social and emotional learning in a post-corona world? I'm briefly before that just going to ask Loic to introduce himself. I know most of you know him, but just so that everyone is on the same page.
I'm Loic. I'm Chief Exec of the Centre for Education and Youth. So I think we're talking about questions today that come into pretty much every bit of our work. And for those of you who don't know, we're an education and youth think and action tank. So we combine working in research, but with a kind of practitioner insight. So most of the team, like me, have been former teachers and youth workers. So we really exist to bring policy and practice much closer together, carrying out rigorous research, but also bringing in the insights of people on the ground, and trying to improve the way we support young people. So this touches on most of the research projects we do. Most of the programs we develop have some touch in some way on SEL. So it'd be really interesting today to find out a bit about your experiences of that in your own context and also globally. So thank you.
Thanks, Loic, and thanks everyone for sort of hearing out the introductions. I just think, given that it's a slightly smaller group, it's really nice just to know who everyone is and where everyone's coming from. So Joycey, over to you. What is the role of social and emotional learning in a post-corona world?
I think the role of SEL continues to be extremely crucial, and especially in a world where people are under lockdown and are not having the interaction that they're used to. I think we'll see increased levels of mental health and well-being issues for young people. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that in addition to supporting health and well-being, we should ensure that schools, parents, as well as youth workers are all focusing on social and emotional learning alongside academic education. Because if we don't focus on that, then the ability to manage emotions, the ability to bounce back from challenges, and the resilience that is needed in young people to create a better world post-coronavirus won't be there. So I would say currently SEL is super important, and in a world after coronavirus, it's going to be even more important.
Thank you. For what it's worth, I completely agree with you. You've mentioned there, Joycey, sort of other stakeholders, parents, sort of other members of the community. To what extent do you see them as being a sort of a target audience for actually developing their own SEL versus being more of a mechanism for facilitating, improvement in that for young people?
I think it has to be both, right? Like if as a teacher or a parent, you don't have the social and emotional skills, then how can you help your kid or your pupil build that? So I think the concept of role modeling is super important. So we need to talk about not just young people building these skills, but also adults building them.
Great, thank you. Please don't forget, by the way, if you want to jump in at any point, do use the hand raise function in chat. I will then get a notification and we'll come to you next. In the absence of anyone actually having used that thus far, Elnaz, I think I might pick on you, just given the breadth of your work at Skills Builder. How does this question sit with you?
I think something that strikes me is that sometimes something that is changing, the structural changes that is happening has bigger impact on young people's well-being in long term. They're not as protected as before, even like working with parents who are struggling at home. That's that they're experiencing might be new, because they were mostly at school, not impacted as much by seeing the real struggle in their parents' day-to-day on daily basis. So I think there are new emerging things that also affecting them as much as before, and how we can help them build the agency, the autonomy, the resilience, as Joyce mentioned, to cope with this daily struggle, but also facing the uncertainty at the end of these lockdown or the period, I think is super important. So the structural problems that existed before carries over, but also there are new areas or new impacts this period is having on young people that we need to consider and find solutions for. So definitely very important, I think, to focus on that, and very right timing for having a discussion about this. But also we have to find solutions to that. So just not raising the problem, but finding a solution to it is also important.
Yeah, thank you. And certainly solutions is something that we'll come on to in more depth a little later. Ed, I'll come over to you. You've raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I think what COVID-19 has highlighted is that beyond teaching and the curriculum, the schools themselves, just going to school is a form of intervention for SEL or psychosocial, and particularly in maybe in a crisis context, but everywhere. I think what this has shown is it highlights the fact that with children not having that routine in school, also just going to a place that is supposed to be safe, they're missing out on psychosocial or social and emotional learning opportunity, and I think bringing that into the spotlight just shows the importance of the school just far beyond just the teaching and the learning.
Absolutely, absolutely, and a whole load of hands have rocketed up there, Ed. First of which was Alex Beard.
Yeah, so I was talking this week. We've been doing lots of interviews with practitioners across our global network, and one in the US runs something called the Springboard Collaborative that works to build family, teacher, child partnerships in low-income communities across the US. And he referenced FDR. He talked about relief, recovery, and reform. And he was thinking about that to guide his work in response to the crisis, particularly focusing on the well-being of students and families throughout his community. And that's reflected across our global network. At the moment, there's a clear SEL need around the well-being of the most vulnerable kids in our network. And we're trying to mobilize different things to support, from the most basic needs to trying to put in place some of the protections that kids would normally have by being in school. As it comes to recovery, I think there's clearly a role there for nurturing the relationships, creating safe spaces for kids to, manage their well-being, deal with any trauma that they've experienced. So there's a kind of recovery phase. And then I think there's this opportunity for reform. Like more than ever, I think we're seeing relationships growing between parents, families, and children around education. And those are not focused fundamentally on academics, but on well-being, on the holistic development of children. So it feels like there's this window, this opportunity for reform as well. Resilience depends on the relationships and not the sort of system structures that have been imposed.
Thank you. And a nice sort of reference back there to, I think, sort of some of Joyce's opening comments about the importance of the wider communities in this. Tiffany, you've raised your hand.
Yes, so from the Economist Foundation perspective, there's a couple of things that we've been looking at. One of those is people deal with information overload in the news, and I think what the coronavirus crisis has shown is that well-being can really be affected, and also an ability to form sound opinions about the news when there's so much information coming at you, and that there's a real importance for building resilience in young people and the skills in order to form sound opinions. That's one area we're really looking at. And then a second one is both an opportunity and a risk around we're really keen on being open-minded. Open-mindedness is one of our skills, and empathy and really engage with different perspectives on lots of different issues. And I think there's an opportunity there that we see people are considering groups, vulnerable people, thinking about the NHS in a bit more detail, key workers. But there's also a bit of a risk. A lot of what we're hearing at the moment is kind of the death of globalization, that areas might be closing down different perspectives and trying to think more insular. And we'd be wanting to work against that with young people and really encouraging that open-mindedness and open discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an interesting point for us to come back to a little later, actually, particularly around the opportunities that this potentially presents. Obviously, of course, acknowledging the risks as well. Catherine, I'm going to come to you next.
Thank you. At the risk of echoing a couple of your previous speakers, I mean, I'd like to completely agree with Edmund about the role of the school and also about the opportunity. There's a lot of content out there, and where I think schools have really risen to the challenge is not only in putting content out, but putting the wraparound around the content, in connecting communities, setting up WhatsApp groups, sending people SMSs, galvanizing trainers to connect with school leaders. And we're also a member of Global Schools Forum, which is a global group of 45 non-state operators. And what a lot of our members are seeing and doing is very much using this opportunity or recognizing in this situation the role that they have at the center of their school community, and reaching out. And we see this as being quite long term. Uganda's just announced another 2 weeks lockdown. And it may be that schools don't actually go back for quite a long time, possibly not even this year. And what we're also seeing, hoping, is that this will be something that we embed for the long term. So, you know, we're creating mini videos we can send out on WhatsApp to parents to help them to be more socially and emotionally strong themselves and connected to their children, providing what they need in the ordinary every day. And I think schools have got a very powerful role to play, and we're really, really seeing schools stepping up.
Great, thank you. Sharath, I'll come to you.
Thanks, Will. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Such interest from the group, and so I was taking lots of notes. But just two thoughts. I think that I think will be a real opportunity for many of us working in or around SEL in emerging. I think, you know, when we've talked about this world of unknown unknowns as the reality that most young people will face in the countries we work in. So in Ethiopia, for example, I think from the forecast that 90% of young people will work in the informal sector. Well, they'll be buffeted by all kinds of changes that are, you know, they will often feel out of their control. I think the COVID situation, I think, has really brought that to life, and I think helped everyone focus on that as a key, you know, really the reality. It's not a sort of, you know, a marketing slogan, but we know the level of uncertainty now that many of us will face. And the second thing, there's been this sort of slightly ridiculous debate in our sector about academics versus socio-emotional learning, and of course, it's not a trade-off. And I think, you know, those of us who are homeschooling and you know, realize that so much more is about the school experience and the relationships, as a few people mentioned. So I think this will be a good chance to really galvanize momentum around SEL, I hope, in both developed and emerging countries as well. So I sort of feel optimistic that this will actually help us in the medium term.
Thanks, Sharath. Great, I think, to bring to the fore the potentially false dichotomy of academics sort of in some way versus SEL, and then no doubt we'll come back to that throughout this discussion as well. David, and then to Jane.
Yeah, I have unmuted, good. I mean, I think my remarks follow on very nicely from Sharath's, at least I think they do. I mean, it's along the same line. But when we think about the impact of this particular disease outbreak, then its impact on many lower income and lower middle income countries will be radically different across the world and in comparison to the developed world. And to think that we can simply understand what that impact will be from afar is, just foolish. We need to think about how we can actually understand from the ground point of view what's going on. Because, the disease in question, if one looks at the burdens that folks in such countries, particularly lower income countries, the burden they face, this is neither here nor there in some respects. I might argue that the lockdown that's being put in place in a number of countries does not serve the locality very well. I mean, you just don't have the opportunity, if you're in a day-to-day existence, to actually cope with the fact that you can't go out for a few days. Fine in nice UK circumstances, but not in other countries. So that's going to produce tremendous pressure on every other system. And in most such outbreaks, even if you take something like Ebola, more people die because of the impact on the rest of the system than die from the disease. So I think understanding systemic aspect on the society is very important. And I've heard, these are just completely anecdotal reports, but they're unsurprising, that the biggest impact will be to create tension and hostility between groups. So one can see a lot of intercommunal violence being the outcome of this. And so understanding that particular part, I think it was Tiffany was talking about a question of open-mindedness and being able to cope with open-mindedness and enable yourself to act upon that basis in the context of such substantial stresses is very difficult but very important. I think that poses a particular challenge for SEL work in this coming era. And then just to sort of round that off, I mean, I thought it was interesting you put down the post-coronavirus world. Well, it won't be post. This likely will be an endemic disease that will carry on. There's no way we're going to deliver vaccinations to make sure that we've wiped out the disease. It was hard enough doing it for smallpox. We haven't done it for polio or measles. This is a new disease of unknown qualities and properties. So I think, some of the thinking we've had previously will need to be recalibrated in light of the view and experience of particular locations.
Thank you, David. And thanks too for picking up on the wording of that question. I completely agree with you. Jane, we'll come to you and then I'll pose the next question. But Jane, to you first.
Thanks, Will. I think that one of the things that's been interesting over the last couple of weeks to watch is how the response from ministries of education has moved away from the day-to-day delivery of content and onto evaluation. So more and more ministries now have been revealing their evaluation frameworks for evaluating the success of remote learning. And in each of the frameworks that I've seen so far, so UAE, Morocco, France have all publicised those, there has been a focus on SEL, which is great. But what I would be really interested to know is how do they propose to actually do anything about that once they get back in the classroom? Because what I worry about is that most contact time in schools anyway is ridiculously overstuffed with curriculum subjects, and that there is the risk that the panic and anxiety around having to catch kids up with curriculum will overtake any good intentions once they get them back into some semblance of schooling. The need to score in the top whatever in PISA or TIMSS or PEARLS, and the fact that that will become a focus for ministries in a way that we won't see policy support for this sort of thing. We won't see space, mechanisms, and the all-important for ministry systems is ways to measure SEL interventions or support. So what I would be really interested to know from this and from other gatherings like this is what are ways to support systems in quick wins to make sure that this actually gets embedded into schooling once return starts to happen and prior to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's really important, I think, for this discussion to be really concrete and to highlight, where there are either quick wins or something more systemic that we can be doing on that front. I want to move on to the second question, which is, up till now, how has SEL been developed? Now, that's a staggeringly broad question, and I think what we're not after here is a history of SEL. I think what I'm really trying to get at here is how is what you're doing being shaped by this in real time? And Ed, I actually wonder if I can come to you first. Maybe you can say a little bit about sort of Xavier project and how this is shaping your ongoing activity.
Yeah, sure. Well, in our context, particularly in refugee camps, a lot of the systems that were there before have completely shut down, as you know, is the same in parts of the world, but it's even more noticeable there, where aid agencies have largely had to pull out staff. So you have community responses really leading in education. So we've adapted by creating podcasts. We have challenge of accessibility and devices as well for the internet. So we've created podcasts that can be shared by MP3, and some of that is touched on SEL. I think going back to points that have been made, is there's just such an increased pressure on caregivers and parents to be delivering this and to try and carry on with general survival while also looking after children. So that's been the immediate effect for us. And I mean, SEL is not the only way of looking at what we do. It's been there always as a presence, but I think it's becoming increasingly important now because of this.
Thanks, Ed. Catherine or David, I wonder if either of you would like to sort of pick up from that in terms of your sense of how this is shaping things, in real time.
Right. I actually my Wi-Fi glitched out, and so I missed some of Ed's comments. So forgive me if I repeat anything that he's already said. But in terms of how SEL's been developed, I don't know if this is answering your question, and how it's evolving in real time. I at risk of repeating myself a bit on the previous question, is we've been developing it in our schools through the kind of ways that you do in the UK, actually, through the pedagogy, through PSHE lessons, through the way we treat people and the way we behave towards each other, and how we're developing it now is, I think it's much more tightly focused. In the sense that you don't have that extended contact, and it's also much looser in the sense that you're working through parents. The positive, as I said, is we've now got more contact with parents than we've ever had before. Our secondary school in Uganda is a boarding school, and half of our students live on the South Sudanese border, so we have very little contact with parents. And so it's for us about trying to encapsulate what we do, what it is, how people can support training and training parents up. And it's also about demonstrating that we care. And these are things that have really, really emerged for us as being what our community needs. And as you said in the previous one, the academic, the content side of things is kind of already there, and the dominant approach is push the content out and let the kids get on with it. And actually, the feedback we're getting is that people need so much more wraparound there. So teachers, we've been calling parents, we've set up WhatsApp groups, we're posting mini how-to videos, we're posting suggestions of ordinary things that you can do with your child, and boosting that connection, and really trying to wrap everyone into a school community, make sure everybody's okay.
Thanks, Catherine. David, did you want to?
Should I come in there? Yes. I mean, you're right, Will. This is a huge history. I found myself bouncing around between 10 million different things one could say about it. But I thought I'd give a little piece from our personal practice, which I think relates a lot to how many schools have developed what they do. Part of my group's work has been about how do you think about somebody who's in the position of holding extreme values and being likely to engage in extreme violence. I mean, this has been some very interesting work, for example, in Pakistan. we've got an intervention which has been developed over many years. And one of the really important things about it, well, there's two components to it, which speak to something that's often dropped from the syllabus and the curriculum. The two things are, on the one hand, an engagement with, if you like, dramatic exercises. I mean, things where kids actually live out particular things, they take part in notional relationships to others. And in a way, that's like a theatrical exercise. It's like drama, because through the drama, they experience their feelings. And it's interesting how often when we talk about social emotional learning, we often don't engage in ways in which the arts, for example, generate emotional significance, thinking about others in the way that you would in the humanities and arts. The second thing is that what's proved so valuable in our work has been doing that, and then enabling a reflective component. And enabling a reflective component for kids at different ages requires a focus on their level of cognitive development. So what we've found in our work, and of course we've drawn on very large parts of that history, but the way we've actually had to distill it for the purposes of particular interventions, it's around this kind of, I mean, to be frank, we've drawn on things from dance and from the theatre of the oppressed, because that generates the sense of the feeling, and then you're encouraging the reflection on the feeling. And that draws on the bigger literatures, but it puts actually back centre stage things to do with the arts that so often get neglected.
Thank you, David. I suppose I'm conscious of how sort of vital the consideration of context is in all of this, and I think it's been, you know, it's been really, really illuminating. Sort of listening to Catherine, David, Ed, who are working in, you know, quite a particular context. Joycey, Elnaz, Toby, Alex, I don't know whether, well, Joycey, I might come to you. I don't know how this sort of aligns with our understanding of what this looks like, either in the UK or in slightly different sort of contexts. What's your sense of that?
So in UK, there are a wide range of approaches that are being used to build social and emotional skills, but the context in which we are operating has changed. So for example, usually skills are either built through the curriculum, where you have some lessons focused on those skills, or it's through extracurricular activities or peer mentoring, but all those things have stopped, right? It's a new world we're living in, where kids are at home and they're spending a lot more time with their parents, their peers or their teachers aren't around. So one of the things we've seen is that a lot of these interventions that we had supported through our grant on the Future Ready Fund, they are shifting from a physical delivery. So for example, Football Beyond Borders is shifting from a physical delivery to an online, you know, delivering the content, but also having those conversations and engaging people that way. The second thing we've seen is that school leaders and teachers are playing a huge role. So, you know, one of the Multi-Academy Trust leaders I was speaking with, he mentioned that they are running online bereavement services because some teachers in their school have passed away, or some of the relatives in the kids' families have passed away. So how do you build SEL when it is outside of your direct curriculum or your extracurricular activities? And people are coming up with some really creative ways of supporting kids who need that support during this really crucial time. And the third thing we're seeing is that there is a greater awareness that until and unless you focus on motivation. So there, you know, this point was made earlier about content. There's so much content out there, you know, BBC Bite Size, Oak Virtual, there are like all the tech companies are providing their products for free. Most of them are anyway. But it's not about the content. And Sharath referred to this earlier about intrinsic motivation, and others have talked about agency. And until and unless you can help people link to that intrinsic motivation, it's very hard to sustain yourself with learning. And one of the things we are doing is that we're working with the behavioral insights team to look at edtech platforms that have seen a huge increase, 10, 12-fold increase in users. How can we make sure that kids are actually engaging and are continuing and persisting when they deal when they have to deal with a difficult problem online. So I think the summary of that is we're seeing some creative ways in which people are responding. We're seeing how behavioral insights can play a huge role in improving motivation, and how you can use technology to help with social and emotional learning.
Thank you, Joyce. That was a really, really helpful summary. Thank you. Alex, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, I just wanted to build briefly on your point about context, Will. One of the things that we have found over the past several years in this work across our network is that SEL has defied any kind of single approach or framework, and any response that has been successful is deeply locally rooted. And so our work as a global organization now focuses on creating reflective frameworks and providing provocations and tools that practitioners can use themselves to make decisions about how to support the SEL of kids and students. And so up to this point, our focus has typically been at the level of teachers. We think teachers and parents are doing this and making individual decisions about it on a daily basis in their planning, whether explicitly or implicitly. And from New Zealand to the US to Estonia to Ghana, that looks very, very different. And within those countries, it also looks different depending on the community context, the groups that are involved. And we think that it has to be contextually driven. We have thought that. However, it now appears like there is an opportunity for something that is more systemic or structural, although we don't have a firm opinion about that anymore. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's really helpful. And actually, this might be a great point to come to you, Andy.
Thanks for that. Yes. So the thing that's been going around my head as I'm listening to these great contributions is reflecting a couple of things that were said earlier about how the challenge of the pandemic can lead to sort of polarizing of communities and groups and attitudes, whether it's related to the priorities for academic outcomes as opposed to social emotional learning, and those align people in other ways as well, or divide people in other ways. One of the things that I think is a high risk, I think, in the countries, the low and middle income countries especially, is that the post and continuing pandemic crisis is going to exacerbate that, and there will be policymakers who have invested a lot of money in getting universal primary education in so many countries as a way of boosting the economy, and see the greatest threat as being a threat to the economy. On the other hand, I wonder, given that this is likely not to be a case of there is a crisis and then there is what happens after the crisis, that there's going to be a continuing challenge that schools across the world will be dealing with, the background of the pandemic, which will grow and recede and grow and recede. That this is a way to think possibly of how schools structure the teaching and learning differently in the classroom and outside the classroom, because getting 100 children into a classroom and teaching them in the traditional way is clearly not going to be a possibility in many contexts. So there's going to have to be a different way of thinking about what teaching and learning looks like, and as well as the purpose. And if policymakers can see exactly that teaching and learning in contexts where you have typically 100 primary school children crammed into a class with very few resources, that has to be flexible enough that teaching and learning can continue outside the classroom when children are confined at home, where teachers have to play a very different role, and parents and families play a different role. the sort of the unit of learning, or the unit of teaching learning becomes different. It's not a 30-minute episode on the timetable. It has to be different. And within that unit or that structure, the content and purpose can be reshaped. But I think, because policymakers have to deal with huge challenges in low-income countries, and having got all the children, millions of children into school through and managed to reduce the fees and find ways of keeping school systems going, they will need to have something that looks very persuasive and that doesn't appeal to that sort of, well, it's academic or social emotional. It's got to be both, and it's going to be both partly because the structure, the context, the location of learning is changing, and that means different actors have to be involved, and the different pacing and different units of teaching and learning have to be developed. So that's not a it's not a very optimistic perspective, but I think just looking at it from what do you say when you're talking to education secretaries, permanent secretaries, curriculum development directors, people who actually have policy decisions to make. It's what sort of language do you talk to them in order to try and get a rethinking which works for them as well as works for the child.
Thank you, Andy. So in a minute, I'm going to conflate the final two questions into one. We've had lots of discussion about what the challenges are throughout. So I think rather than sort of focusing on that specifically, let's think together both about what the challenges are and then the support that teachers and others will need in order to support CEL moving forwards. Before we move on to that final question, and Andy, I think your comment there was a great sort of segue around towards that. Sharath, I'm going to come to you.
Thanks, Will. So just a very quick thought, really. It was so interesting hearing the different range of responses around the 3 minutes. Sort of the question that made me wonder is whether we certainly see, in countries like Uganda, huge pressure by the government, or a sense of pressure that they need to move now. So, for example, radio slots being used to engage children at home, all of these things. And of course, these things are useful. But the reality of I have 2 young kids in the house, and it's hard to help them. With all the advantages we have in the UK, for example. I just wonder if this time could be a good time for us to take a pause and just some of these broader issues that many of our panel raised. Is this the time to think about that, and really how do we rebound rather than just immediately focus on the very, very short term? That was just a broader thought that came through well as well, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Sharath. And I think actually in many ways that's a great segue into our final question around the specific support that teachers, that other professionals will need, in order to continue to endorse and embed CEL in their settings as we move forwards. I don't know whether anyone would like to dive in on that.
See, just in terms of one of the things that was highlighted by a number of people around the lack of time, not just for teachers, but also parents, because I've got 2 kids here and I'm struggling to homeschool them while I'm in back-to-back calls. And I think if we can make it easier, so as schools return back or as kids return back to school, I think it would be really important to have some sort of third-party organizations or providers who can help with running some structured programs so that both teachers and pupil have the headspace and the time to do this. Now, there's a bigger question around how do you create that space and time, and what role can school leaders or policymakers play? So I think collectively we do need to influence the systems change that Alex was talking about, or Sharath referred to as the longer term thinking. So unfortunately, I don't have any answers, but I've identified that there is a huge problem when it comes to time, and there are things we can do to remove some of those obstacles, the immediate ones, but I think there has to be some coordinated effort to bring about that systems level change.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, I'll come to you next.
Thank you. I think you're right about the challenges of home learning. One point I'd like to make is the massive difference between primary and secondary. I mean, I've got 3 secondary children home learning downstairs right now, and I make them tea and toast in the morning, and then I see them at 3:30 when they finish. And my colleagues who have primary school children, I think they've acquired a new respect for teachers when they realise quite how difficult it is. So I think that's one point worth making, is that it is very different. I think another point is about, in many ways, this is also an opportunity to upskill our young people. I mean, just as we've all avoided home working for a long time, we've had Khan Academy for years and years and years, and very few people are really using it outside these very, very developed economies or highly active settings. And for us, this is an opportunity to upskill our young people, to get them used to doing things online, having discussions, conversations, quizzes, handing in work, all of that kind of thing. There are big issues to do with the skills of teachers, many of whom are not at all comfortable with technology. For us, again, it's been an opportunity to upskill teachers, because, again, they've sort of been avoiding this for years. But I do think in terms of what needs to be done, upskilling is one key thing. Access is another. Access to devices, access to airtime. There's an organisation in Rwanda that is making sure that every school has access to 2 smartphones. And so that sort of access to devices, I think, because you can do a certain amount on SMS, and phone technology is very widely spread, that's fine. But sort of smartphone technology, and that sort of in terms of the sort of like new learning. The other positive I would make, I get your point out, Andy, about pushing out, governments pushing stuff out. What's quite interesting for us in Uganda is that the quality of what the government's been pushed out is high. So again, this makes the whole social and emotional side really important. And what you're actually getting, which I think is very, bearing in mind that a lot of schools do not have access to textbooks or very patchy access, the fact that the government can push out high quality content on TV, bearing in mind all the difficulties, is TV and radio are fairly widespread, people can access them. And so one of the positives here might be consistency of content, access to high quality content. And then to reiterate what I've said earlier, is I do think then the really important role that schools can play is in that motivation side, it's in the engagement, and in the social side, in the wraparound, making sure everybody's okay, connecting people in communities. But with the government content, making sure everybody knows when it's on, organising discussions in WhatsApp after that content. And in terms of how things might change in future, the other big positive we feel is that this, I think, is pushing into communities that don't have access to education necessarily. I mean, governments have been very successful at getting children into schools, but there is a question around the quality of what they get and the access to resources that they have. And yet access to phones, potentially TV, could reach into communities and homes that are not necessarily accessing terribly high quality education. So I think there could be a lot of interesting changes and some opportunities.
Thank you very much for that. Toby, I'm going to come to you next.
Thanks, Will. So in not answering the third question, I'm rolling up the 3. I've been lazy and I'll do all 3 in one. So some observations. One is, one of the things that we're all aware of is it's easier to look at remote teaching in terms of SEL with youngsters you know, and it's going to be a particular challenge come September with new youngsters, potentially with some hybrid teaching, where some schools across the world are going to be teaching still youngsters remotely who they've never met. And it's very hard to have that informal relationship and to teach them, but also to meet their social emotional needs if you never even met them, and you can't even have a joke and you don't even recognize their voice sometimes. So quite a lot of the platforms, you can't see everybody's face because of the number of youngsters, and so you're dependent on knowing their voice and saying, yes, thank you, John, but you can't do that if you don't know them. That's the first obvious, but something immediate. In terms of the longer term, for me, the interesting is I immediately moved to policy because of all my work across that I've done. I've never met an education minister who doesn't understand the importance of SEL. They don't want rampant, uneducated, recalcitrant citizens. They want well-informed, well-groomed, articulate, well-behaved citizens. But I also have a tension, and I think it's going to become even more pronounced after this crisis, where people want results and feel accountable for the money that's spent on education. And, you know, of course, that's the knowledge skills debate is well worn here. You can imagine the arguments I have repeatedly with people saying it's neither one nor the other, it's a false dichotomy. We all know you need knowledge and skills to apply them, and very few disagree in the end. However, I think if SEL's going to survive and we're going to build on the fact that people understand there's now a need, it's never been more important, then I think there might need to be the unsavoury side of some form of assessment or formalisation of that to justify the continued focus, spending, and maybe knit it into some accountability framework. And I think there might be an opportunity here to get that done, but it would have to be away from some more of the fluffy stuff whilst also remembering the effective stuff. So I think there might be an opportunity now to look for a curriculum, a framework, a passport, an assessment that would formalise and justify the time, the funding and the focus that it inevitably needs. My final point is the other thing that, of course, both in the UK lockdown but also worldwide has shown is that those youngsters whose parents don't value education, and I don't think that's necessarily linked to deprivation. In fact, in the UK it certainly isn't necessarily. Those parents who don't value education as much as others can end up further marginalising, further isolating their youngsters, both from formal education and standards that will help them do academically well, but also importantly, the SEL and support from peers and professionals during lockdown. So it sort of further divides and makes it even more dangerous. So we could have some very damaged, traumatised, isolated, marginalised youngsters returning both in the UK and across the world post-lockdown. So I answered all three questions with a mini lecture. There you go, Will. Only because I've just learned how to raise my hand. I'm now going to put it down.
Thank you, Toby.
Okay, thanks, Will. I was going to say, on the question of what's needed, leading on actually from what Toby said, I think that the tools that are needed are the ones that are already available in the system. And what we need to do is to work out how to mobilise those in a way that can quickly support SEL needs. I think that we've learned already from the lockdowns that what systems don't need is a whole slew of new stuff which they hadn't already understood how to use or how to mobilise quickly or how to integrate into their teaching and learning. So, you know, those things that already have reach in education systems, things like textbooks, things like curricula that should be based on those textbooks. And I do agree that actually to get that sort of space and I guess priority treatment for SEL and those things, we do need to consider assessment as well, because the things that get investment are the things that you can measure. And the other thing I was going to mention around that is if you are going to use the tools that are already available in the system, we need to make sure there is coherence around using them, so that SEL interventions don't become these siloed, oh, now you need to stop doing maths because we're going to do SEL. Because I think that is where really good interventions die quickly. And that if we can make this mainstreamed, if we can make it an expected requirement, basically a culling criteria of what we consider to be a high quality textbook, a high quality digital platform or edtech or teacher training program or whatever, or curriculum or whatever it might be. And that might mean linking things like funding mechanisms to the expectation of seeing it. And it certainly means accountability. then that way it doesn't become something that we need to discuss how you do. It becomes something that there's just an expectation that you will do.
Thank you. Alex, if we come to you next.
Yeah, and I guess, building on the point that Toby and Jane have made about the quality of interventions which exist, the policies, the programs. I think when we think about success of any reform in education, we think about the programs, we think about the people. And I think that from our perspective, it would be really, really important to think what it means to invest in the relationships, the units, the communities, the groups of people that will sustain successfully a focus on SEL in the future. And I think there are some barriers. There's a barrier that I do think and perhaps it is to some extent a zero-sum game in education. There's only a certain number of interventions that you can implement at any one time. Teachers perhaps feel somewhat overwhelmed despite the quality of things. And then for me, the question is how to build on what is happening with the increasing involvement of parents and teachers in the development of kids. And I wonder what we can do as actors within the education system to continue to nurture the relationships that are being built or that exist already, so that we're investing first of all in the relationships which are needed to give the motivation which will then sustain the programs and interventions to ensure that they're successful. So how do we sort of prepare that ground as practitioners for interventions to work?
Great. Thank you. David, and then we'll finish with Ed.
Very quickly, just to follow on from what Alex was saying in some respects, because as I heard him, the way he's breaking down this, what we've been talking about as an undifferentiated lump, i.e. SEL, there's many things that go under that heading. And of course, as we address the agenda of SEL in schools, then we have to think about how we do the different parts and how they work together as the functions of the child's age and stage. There's been a thing in our conversation about the increasing use of online delivery, particularly over media like this. And I think it would be unwise to assume that everything you can do face-to-face you can do online. There's many reasons for believing that's just not so. So I think one of the uncharted challenges, to go back to your opening remark on that note you sent round, is what can actually be delivered successfully in the SEL space online and what can't, and what you prioritize. Because we mustn't forget the online environment has been associated with some very serious breakdowns of behavior amongst kids in schools around cyberbullying. We're also finding that with our work with the Home Office, many children who might ordinarily just not be connected to anything, becoming connected via the possibilities of this media to actually quite seriously worrying groups out there in the community. And so their social emotional goes down a particular pathway. So I think there are some important questions that emerge from this conversation that need to be put forward for some further investigation to take us into this new post-coronavirus world, if it is post.
Thank you. Let's just say from my very brief experience of trying to administer an online Zoom workshop, I completely sympathise with the point about trying to move things online.
You're doing great.
Thank you. Ed, we'll come to you and then we will drop out of the breakout session and go back for the summary. So Ed, over to you.
Yeah, just following on from what Jane and Toby have been saying in terms of increased investment and possibility of results frameworks, I wonder if at the systems level more could be done, in terms of funding. A lot of education is either non-profit or even in terms of investment, like having SEL more embedded in the results frameworks of every education from the planning phases. But also, I don't know about at the learner level, but certainly at teacher level, in my context, nearly all the teachers I've ever worked with have had zero exposure to SEL in their training. A lot of them have had virtually no training, but even those who have not really had serious SEL training. So maybe looking at the results framework at that level and then assessing from the professional development level rather than at the learning outcome level might be the place to start if we're going to have a universal framework. If it isn't already happening, it will be encouraged.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to close the meeting room. It'll take about a minute or so, and we will be rejoining the main meeting space where Loic and Ellie will provide some summaries of the conversation. But thank you so much for everything you've said. It's been a really rich conversation, and I think really, really illuminating on all sorts of levels. So thank you.